Welcome back to our discussion, Confident IT Resiliency in Uncertain Times, sponsored by Veritas here on Federal News Network. My guests today are Scott Sloan, Senior Director of Sales Engineering for U.S. Public Sector at Veritas, and Alex Restrepo, Senior Principal for Solutions Marketing at Veritas. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And Scott, let's start with you and talk about some of the other unknowns that can affect federal agencies. They could be known to be happening, but you don't know what the outcome will be, such as a change in policy. We've been discussing the COVID and the stress on resiliency that is placed. That's a true unknown, but there's a lot of known unknowns, I guess. What are some of those and how can they affect resiliency?
Yeah, any unknowns. I mean, COVID-19 is a kind of perfect example from everybody working from home and then trying to, it forced every agency to really address their technical debt and modernize in a very short time. So, and take, for example, the federal telework program, it's been around for many years. So you would assume agencies would have already had a robust remote access solution in place. Now, unfortunately, for some of this was not the case. I think a recent OPM report to Congress highlighted the issue and shows only 22% of employees teleworked in 2018. So one could draw a conclusion from this report, the incredible magnitude our government faced when they shifted to a work from home policy and the amount of work, required to implement, remote access solutions. Some agencies experienced insufficient bandwidth and infrastructure to, support an extensive telework program, and others the lack of available technology, like laptops and collaboration tools to enable people to work from home. Now, granted, most agencies had a contingency plan for regional event, but no one really was prepared for an entire global workforce, working from home. So, also, existing regulations are creating new challenges. For example, the Federal Records Act, which, it's been around since 1950, requires the management of record creation, maintenance, and disposition. And let's not forget about the increase in FOIA requests that we're going to see due to the COVID-19 crisis. So how will agencies now manage this data that is created on a remote worker's laptop and in some cases a bring your own device, Tom?
And there's also the data transparency laws. There's a couple of those that have passed in recent years, like the Data Act, which makes you have to know stuff and where it is and how to report it in ways that agencies had never had to do before. And in fact, even though some of them have been around for several years and they still get report cards on it, there's a long way to go there.
Yes, for sure.
And also I would throw in the fact that formally by law, there is transition planning going for the next administration, regardless of which party, does win. By law, they have to plan for transition because the law considers the retention of incumbency also a transition. And so there's a lot that could happen with just new policymakers coming in to replace the ones that are there now.
When you're looking at the transition between administrations, or really any change of custodianship of data, an example again is when someone who is a custodian of data has to provide it. You mentioned earlier FOIA requests. It's important to have the right tools to be able to achieve that, and it can be difficult if you don't. And that's actually something where a substitute may not work. There really isn't a good, you could script it out and try to do it that way, but it's going to take you forever. Anybody that's tried to do this in terms of searching, terabytes and terabytes of data understands the challenge involved in finding specific items that are necessary to fulfill a FOIA request or to meet guidelines in terms of transition of power and things like you mentioned. And so luckily, of course, we have tools that are capable of doing exactly that in terms of Boolean type searches that on the back end are intelligent enough to then provide the required data. And so that's part of the strength that we have in terms of representing, again, a software-defined agnostic approach to data, but covering all manner of availability, protection, and insights, which is really what we're talking about there, is insights into your data and making sure that you're not concerned about that risk of the unknown or risk of complexity, which is kind of both there in terms of FOIA requests. Sometimes it's a little just too complex, the amount of data, and other times is you just don't know what FOIA request is going to come in. So how do you quickly adjust to that? Or maybe you don't know what data has been generated over the course of the last administration, all right? So I agree that that's a significant challenge that needs to be addressed by any agency today.
And what about the discovery of data that you may not have or that you might need, but or possibly not even know you don't have. In the case of, say, the stimulus checks that were going out.
Sure.
That far more complex question than it sounded like to the public because of all the data sets to make sure that only the people that deserve them got them, that were by law should get them, and also that those people were still living. And sometimes if you have a year-old database that you're accessing, you may not have the most current vital statistics to inform that kind of process. So if you look at improper payments as a threat to resiliency, then data becomes a paramount issue there also.
Yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, it's going to come down to whenever you're transacting with anything that's considered this level of sensitivity, right? So personal information, personally identifiable information, information that's protected either by law, regulation, or just policy of an agency. You need to make sure that you're covered and you have the correct tools to be able to execute on that. And again, having something akin to a Google search, right? A simple Boolean search for inside of your files for specific terms, such as stimulus check, let's say. That's a new term, something that maybe wasn't previously in a lexicon. Being able to adjust that on the fly and incorporate that is a key element of being resilient to the unknowns.
And Scott, as you go from agency to agency, what are you hearing are the pain points with respect to ensuring they can keep going no matter what on that mission delivery?
Yeah, I mean, we already see impact to missions and outcomes. Some agencies have put projects on hold while they only focus on keeping their mission afloat. While others haven't missed a beat. They've been able to adapt to the changing environment, since they had a good response plan in place.
And I guess the final question should be analytics, because we've been talking about data virtualization, but really understanding the problem at hand is a problem of analytics. So how does that have a role in resiliency?
Sure. So we talked a little bit about being able to understand the data, and especially, in terms of some of the requests that might come up and being able to search data. But it's not just the data. It's also analytics about the environment itself. A little earlier, we touched on some of the complexity that might be involved in terms of adopting new technologies and growing environments. And in particular, I know Scott touched on the fact that most of this has been additive as opposed to replacing previous technologies. And so that can become a real challenge to be able to understand everything that's going on and make sure that you're accountable. Number one, if you don't know what you have, it's hard to make sure it's highly available. You want to make sure you can do that. And then number two, if you don't know what you have, you can't really take advantage of it all. And you want to be careful because obviously budget dollars are getting tighter, but yet demands are growing. So you need to be intelligent about how you use your resources, and understanding that having analytics on the infrastructure itself is key to being able to execute on that.
All right, so let's hope your agency is among the adapters. I want to thank today's guests. Scott Sloan is Senior Director of Sales Engineering for U.S. Public Sector at Veritas, and Alex Restrepo, Senior Principal for Solutions Marketing at Veritas. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, go to federalnewsnetwork.com and search Operational Resiliency.